how to use robotics. So anyway, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Fumio. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the other organizers of the workshop. I realize we're running about 15 minutes behind, so I'll give my presentation. I'm happy to answer one or two questions, but I'm here all day, so maybe we can have more Q&A during the coffee break and lunch. So what I'd like to do today is talk about 3 recent research projects from my group that my students and I, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, refer to as protean machines. So I want to use this term to try and direct our thinking about the future of soft robotics. The organizers asked us to put out some ideas about where our field might be going. We use this term protean machines rather than soft robots to try and focus our thinking on what these machines might be able to do rather than how they're made. So as most of us know, soft robots aren't always soft. They're made up of interesting material properties, some soft, some rigid. Protean machines, on the other hand, like their namesake, the Greek god Proteus, are capable of constantly changing form, and by constantly changing form, they can also constantly change function. So the long-term goal in my group for soft robotics or protean machines is to create machines that are continuously changing geometry, material properties, control, in order to do things that are difficult or impossible for a non-soft robot to do. Fumio was already talking about specialized machines. If we want to create general purpose machines, I would argue it's going to be very difficult to make a general purpose machine that has one fixed form, and we're just adapting control. So how do we adapt form and control to broaden the functionality of our machines? So that's sort of the vision for our group and something I'd love to discuss today in this workshop. So before I talk about our protean machines, just a little bit of background. This is a very similar picture to one Fumio just showed you. We're getting pretty good at manufacturing soft robots. This is just a small set of the physical soft robots that are reported out in the literature these days. And I would argue that our ability to manufacture these machines is running ahead of our ability to design them. So as also Fumio just mentioned, we try and use, in my group and others, we try and use evolutionary approaches to automatically design these machines and then rely on our engineering and roboticist colleagues to manufacture our evolved designs. So just to sort of show you the background of how this works, this is some work by one of my former students, Nick Cheney and Hod Lipson. In all the work you're going to see here, we work in simulation. This is the Vox Cad Simulator, and as you can see here, Vox Cad takes a finite element approach to simulating soft robots. Robots are simulated as aggregations of 3D pixels or voxels. In this early experiment, each voxel belongs to one of 4 types. You can see the red and green voxels here. These voxels are controlled by an open loop controller that oscillates the volumes of red and green in antiphase. So these are kind of like muscle. If you look carefully, you'll see a light blue voxel, which is passive soft material, the robot analog of fat. And if you look carefully again, you might see in a few of these robots some dark gray voxels, which is passive rigid material, the soft robot equivalent of bone. So what you're watching in this video is a snapshot throughout this evolutionary process where you see the best robot in the population at any given time. So we have a population of these machines, and the evolutionary algorithm is designing the geometry and the distribution of material across the body plan of these robots. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this works in a moment. So that's evolving soft robots, as Fumio mentioned. And also, like Fumio showed you, how do we move forward with this idea of protean machines? So evolutionary robotics usually gives us changes in morphology and control over evolutionary time, but any one robot usually has a relatively fixed morphology and controller. So how do we evolve protean machines, machines that themselves change morphology and control over their lifetime? Well, as always, Mother Nature has already figured out how to do that, and she does that using the process of evo-devo, which is short for the evolution of development. So in nature, evolution doesn't produce a fixed blueprint. Evolution dictates how a morphology grows from an individual cell into a multicellular organism. And in evo-devo, then you can then look at an evolving population at 3 different time scales. You can look at the second or minute time scale and describe the biomechanics or the learning of a machine, how it's actually coordinating its behavior in its ecological niche. At the middle time scale, you can watch the lifetime of an organism or a soft robot, as you'll see in a moment, and describe how the morphological and nervous control, the neural system of that organism changes over its lifetime. And then finally, at the evolutionary time scale, you can look at how evolution changes the developmental trajectory of organisms. So we have behavior, devo in the middle, and evo at the bottom level. And I'm going to now switch to soft robots and show you these 3 time scales put together. Before I do, just a little bit about how this actually works. Going back to Nick Cheney's work in 2013, Nick used then, and we still use today, a state-of-the-art evolutionary algorithm called HyperNeat. HyperNeat maintains a population of CPPNs, compositional pattern-producing networks. You see one of these CPPNs on the left. What a CPPN does, it's a network, as you see. It takes as input positions in some 2D or 3D space and paints regular structure in that space. So in the application of soft robotics, we have this empty 3-dimensional cage. We take our CPPN, which is our genome. We visit each candidate position in this cage, one after the other. We input the X, Y, and Z coordinate of that candidate position. And in this case, at each position, we have 2 output neurons, which you see at the bottom left. The first binary output neuron indicates whether there is a voxel placed at that position or not. If there is a voxel placed at that position, the second output neuron paints that voxel with one of 4 colors, which are the 4 material properties. So for a given CPPN, it creates an arbitrary geometry and a distribution of material properties across the body. We then have a population of these CPPNs, and we evolve them over time with a fitness function that selects for whatever we want our soft robot to do. So that's a crash course in evolutionary robotics. In more recent work, my PhD student Sam Kriegman added a 3rd output neuron here, and this 3rd output neuron is going to dictate developmental change. So this 3rd output neuron is going to indicate for each voxel how it expands or contracts over the lifetime of the robot. So we're introducing this middle time scale devo. And I'll show you now how what this actually looks like in practice. Simplest thing you can do is start with a set of voxels, and then we use an open loop controller, where in this case, all of the voxels are expanding and contracting in phase. So we have a fixed open loop control. This is the here and now time scale. As you can see, with just this morphology, this robot doesn't do a lot. We then paint on top of that a developmental trajectory. So in this case, you can see that some of the voxels are expanding and some are contracting. So this robot is growing or developing over its lifetime. If we take the open loop controller and combine it with this developmental program, you'll get the following. You can tell that this is a robot that was evolved for forward locomotion. If you watch carefully, you'll notice over the lifetime of this robot, there are short periods in which the robot moves quickly and short periods in which it moves slowly. So we've combined 2 monotonic processes, the constant frequency of the open loop controller with the constant expansion and contraction of the developmental trajectory. And by putting those 2 monotonic processes together that operate at different time scales, I'll just start this video again. You get positive interference. There are periods during which those 2 timescales synergize and the robot goes quickly, and other periods in which there is negative interference and the robot slows down. Why does that matter? It matters because usually when we're evolving these robots, we're looking for a needle in the haystack. So we're looking for a very small subset of the entire space of robots in which that robot can exhibit the behavior of interest. In this case, it's rapid locomotion. If you have a robot that's changing over its lifetime, if you have a machine that's protean, you have a much higher likelihood of passing over the needle in the haystack. You're much more likely to produce a robot that, at least during part of its lifetime, exhibits the rudiments of the behavior you're after. It might lose it, but as long as it shows up for a short period of time, evolution can then subsequently mutate descendants of that robot and expand the period of time during which the needle, so to speak, is exhibited. So that's why Devo is useful. I'm now going to go to the third time scale, evolution. So you can see in the top row here, this is an ancestor, and you can see a descendant of that ancestor in the bottom row. The only difference between these two robots is they have different Devo. They have two different developmental trajectories. In the top case, the needle was discovered. There was a short period during which the ancestor moved quickly. And in the descendant, that particular body plan that gave rise to rapid locomotion has been lengthened throughout the length of the lifetime of the robot. This is a common phenomenon known in biology for over 100 years. It's known as the Baldwin Effect. So through development, an organism stumbles across a useful phenotype, and its descendants exhibit more and more of that phenotype until eventually organisms are born that exhibit that phenotype throughout their lifetime, and that phenotype is lost. It's a famous paper in the machine learning community written by Hinton and Nolan called How Learning Can Guide Evolution, which touched on this idea. But learning is just one of many adaptive processes that exist within development. So development is sort of a generalization of learning. So that's Evo, Devo, Soro, if you like, the evolution of development in soft robots. I'm going to show you a second project now. This is more recent work by Francesco Carucci and Cecilia Lasci. This was a collaboration to extend this idea. In this case, we now have, every robot is made up of two CPPNs. Remember that a CPPN paints regular structure inside of a space. The first CPPN is going to paint the morphology, the geometry and material properties of the machine. And the second CPPN is going to paint a controller onto that robot. In this case, we still have a relatively simple open loop controller. It's going to paint a particular frequency and phase offset onto the active parts of the robot. In this simplified case, the red voxels are going to be active parts of the robot, and light blue is passive soft structure. Okay. This paper is currently in press at the Soft Robotics Journal. It will be out shortly. Here is one evolved robot. You can see that the majority of this robot is actually passive structure. You can see now the patterning of red and green is showing the phase offset of the open loop controller. You can see that the minority of this robot is active material. So this is in some way the soft robot equivalent of passive dynamic walking machines, if you remember those, where basically evolution is again exploiting the morphology and the material properties, in this case, to achieve quadrupedal locomotion with relatively little and simple control. Okay, so we now have a robot that's changing morphology and control. I'm going to move on to the third project now, which is, again, a more recent application. This is work together with Sam Kriegman again and Francesco Carucci from Cecilia's lab. When I showed you Devo before, I was showing you what's known as ballistic development. Ballistic development means that the developmental program will unfold in the organism or the robot, regardless of what's going on in the organism or robot's environment. In this third and final project, I'm going to show you environment-mediated development, which means as the robot performs its behavior in its given task environment, environmental signals can change the way the robot develops, which is the sort of standard way development occurs in nature. So how did we switch from ballistic development to environment-mediated development? We made a very small change to the previous project. Again, each robot is designed by a morphology CPPN and a control CPPN. In this case, we've added a third output neuron, again, to the CPPN that paints the morphology. This third output neuron is going to paint a coefficient onto an ordinary differential equation, which you see in the bottom left. And this ordinary differential equation is going to dictate for each voxel how its stiffness changes in response to stress, engineering stress in this case. The coefficient is going to dictate how that voxel changes its stiffness in response to stress. For example, if a given voxel has an alpha of 0, that means whatever its default stiffness is, it does not change over the lifetime of the robot. A voxel with a positive alpha is going to stiffen in response to increased engineering stress, and a negative value for alpha is going to indicate that that voxel softens in the presence of increased stress and stiffens as stress decreases. Within any one robot, they may have different alphas. So in essence, what this third output neuron is doing is painting different coefficients in a set of ODEs distributed across the body of the robot. Okay, so I'll show you now a video to show you how this works. We're going to be reporting this work next month at the Evolutionary Computation Conference, GECCO. In this video, the color is going to indicate at that given time the stiffness of that voxel. And you can see already at the beginning of the lifetime of this robot, there's already a continuum or a gradient of material properties across the robot's body. In this video, watch the front foot, if you like. It starts relatively soft, and as it moves, that part of the body becomes stiffer. And it turns out that for this morphology, there is much more engineering stress at that point than at other points in the body. And that voxel has evolved a positive alpha, meaning that it stiffens in response to increased stress. Elsewhere in the body, you'll see, particularly at the top of the body, there is a lot of soft material, and the robot is in essence sort of literally throwing its weight around as it's moving. So there's relatively little stress at the top of the body, and that part of the body softens. If you look at the feet again, you'll see that the two front feet and the single back foot are continuing to stiffen. So in essence, it's building stiffer feet and using the soft upper part of its body to make its movement more energy efficient. So something like a flexible spine in the robot. So at different parts of the body, there are different changes in material properties, and this is all within one robot. There are other robots in the population that have evolved different developmental trajectories. So although relatively simple, we have all the basic pieces of Evo-Devo in here now. We have evolution dictating how a robot develops or changes its body in response to environmental signals. Okay, all of this work, we've now put this up in a GitHub repo. My student Sam Kriegman has Evo Soro. You can go check out the GitHub repo. For those of you that are interested in simulating and evolving soft robots, this is a relatively easy way to get started before you move on to hardware. We've just put up this repo, so we'd love to get some feedback on it. Please do let us know whether it's useful for your projects. Just to sort of summarize now, I've tried to argue for this idea of protean machines, where we focus on what the robots can do, which is change their form, and what opportunities that gives those machines beyond non-protean machines, which is that they can change their function more easily because they can change their form more easily. I've showed you some protean machines that can change their geometry. Here's another one that evolved. This one is changing its geometry as well, and by doing so, it changes from a walker into a roller. So this is not a walking machine, it's not a rolling machine, it's a protean machine. As it changes its body, it's able to exhibit different behaviors under different conditions. We could also, for example, change the topology. We can connect or disconnect these machines together, somewhat similarly to what Fumiya showed you. This has been the goal of modular robotics for a long time. So we can also change not just geometry, but also topology. We can change the material properties, as I just showed you. This is a robot that grows calluses on its feet. And of course, we can also change the control of the robot. Up to this point in robotics, it's been very difficult to change morphology of physical machines. So there's been a lot of emphasis on optimizing controllers for fixed morphology robots. One of my hopes for the field of soft robotics is as it becomes easier to change the body of soft robots, either in simulation or reality, we can broaden our thinking about adaptive processes from just learning to development in general. What are some of the opportunities and challenges? By incorporating development, or this protean nature, it actually makes it easier to evolve these machines. Recall that this machine is evolved and it's speeding up and slowing down over its lifetime. So those slight and intermittent increases and decreases in fitness provide a lot of rich material for evolution to work on. For most robotics applications, what we want the robot to do is a very, very small subset of the entire design space. And by incorporating development, we make it easier for evolution to find those needles in the haystacks. An opportunity, I think, for the field of soft robotics is to really convince our non-soft robotics colleagues that there really are things that protean machines can do that non-protean machines cannot. This is, again, some work together with Nick Cheney and Hod Lipson. We published a few years ago, demonstrate evolving soft robots to escape through very small apertures. A challenge here is to, again, improve evolvability. I've argued that Devo helps, but we still have a long way to go. As Fumiya mentioned, we need to perform a lot of evaluations to find or discover a robot that does what we want it to do. There's a lot of work to be done on the evolutionary algorithm and machine learning side of things to more efficiently discover useful soft robots in the overall design space. Realizing these simulated robots in reality remains a challenge. This has been a challenge for a long time in robotics, known as crossing the reality gap. We recently started a funded project with Rebecca Kramer-Bottiglio at Yale to transfer some of these simulated robots to her robot fabric approach. Again, there are multiple hardware instantiations that could realize some of these simulated machines, but how to do so and how to do so well remains an open problem, and I think an interesting challenge for our field as we move forward. One approach to this that I've worked on in the past is the idea of actually reverse engineering a simulator. In previous work, we did this with traditional robotics. We have a physical machine, and as it's behaving, it's generating sensor motor data. We take that sensor motor data, feed it back into the simulation, and evolve simulators to more accurately reflect reality. So this video is kind of a mashup of these two processes. I'll play it again for you. As the physical machine is operating, you can see that the simulator is being evolved to better match reality. Can we do the same thing with the Vox Cad soft robotics simulator and other soft robot simulators? As an alternative to evaluating every robot in reality, hopefully, I'm hoping there's a place for simulation in the field of soft robotics, but closing the reality gap remains an open challenge. Okay, I'd like to thank our funding agencies for this, NASA, the Army Research Office, the US National Science Foundation, and DARPA that have funded various aspects of the projects I've showed you today. And I'd like to thank my collaborators, Nick, Francesco, and Sam. Thanks very much, and I have time for one or two questions.
All right, any questions from the audience?